North Carolina A&T walks out of spring practice with their biggest question still unanswered. Oh yeah, it's locked on HBCU. Play my music.
You are Locked On HBCU, your daily podcast covering HBCU sports. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, family? Welcome back to another episode of the Locked On HBCU podcast, your number one daily one-stop shop for everything HBCU athletics, Monday through Friday, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And now, of course, Sam Darian Gray, a.k.a. the Mouth of the South, Texas Southern alum and former TSU Herald Sports editor. Thank you for going on this journey with me, making Locked On HBCU your first listen of the day every day. And of course, just because the mic cuts off does not mean that the journey is over. Just means it's time to follow me on Twitter at South Exclusives at the bottom of the screen. You see it, but if you don't, that means you're on the audio side of things, and I still appreciate you. Just don't forget the S on the end of South Exclusives when you follow me on Twitter. Now, we have kind of a football, basketball sandwich today. We're going to close out the episode talking about Isaiah Land, not only being the biggest player in notoriety, not size, but biggest player at FAMU's Pro Day, but then also the biggest story. Joe Bryant had an MVP performance at the Reese's All-Star game. But we're going to open it all up, right? That's the bottom bun. That's the meat. But how do you do with the top bun, right? That's the first thing you're going to taste. And the first taste I'm going to give you is North Carolina A&T, who walks out of spring practice with their biggest questions still unanswered. And the biggest questions of any spring practice is, what are the position battles looking like? What are we going to get as far as depth chart, starting quarterback, things of that nature, in all of their battles will extend into the fall. That's not surprising, but here is what Vincent Brown, new North Carolina A&T head coach, had to say about that. He said, we're going to have an open competition for all positions going into training camp. I would probably say that is going to be the case 10 to 15 days going into the first game before we settle on who the starters will be. That's not shocking to me. You know, since wins and losses aren't a thing in spring practice, yes, you have scrimmages and a team does win, but wins and losses aren't a thing. The record is not a thing. This isn't the COVID year. Spring games do not count. They're only for you to get better and for you to achieve two things. One, you want to have some clarity on position battles. That's one thing you want to have. And then that also kind of goes hand in hand with you want to learn the system. And those two things come together, learning the system and in position battles, they come together to be the reason why Vincent Brown said the things he said. You hear him talking about open competition of all positions going into camp. 10 to 15 days before the first game is when they'll settle on the starters. Well, that's because he's new. This is his first year at North Carolina A&T as the head coach. And when you're in the first year of your head coaching tenure at a new spot, that means that everybody has to learn new systems, offense, defense. Yes, defense might be a little bit easier if you're just going from a 4-3 to another 4-3 coach, but not the exact same. And then also, if you're talking about offense, you're always going to have some tweaks, and they're going to have them. We're going to talk about what the quarterback said about these tweaks in the offense as well, because they really do like them. But overall, you might have some players who are safe, who aren't really fighting for a job or anything like that, but everybody's going to have to be on that learning curve. Like, I highly doubt that Prunty is fighting for a starting cornerback position. He's got that. He just needs to learn Vincent Brown's system. That's it. But some players are fighting for a system, and if you are introducing new knowledge to every single player, because you're going to be introducing new knowledge to some players every spring practice, but when you have a new coach, you're introducing new knowledge to everybody. And when everybody's getting new knowledge, it's kind of difficult to really decide on who's going to be your starter in just 4 weeks. In just a month's time, it's kind of hard to get a firm grasp of everybody who is learning the system, how quickly they're picking it up, how quickly they're executing it, what's the talent level, who's the best fit for you. This is logical that it would extend into the fall. That just makes sense because everybody's learning something new. But when you look at the quarterbacks, they have a larger mental load than pretty much everybody else. They have to know what every single player is doing on every single play, right? So you're going to need to grasp more. The mental load alone is enough for you to not make that decision until middle of August. Like, that's enough for that. And then you have to add in the fact that Vincent Brown has no allegiance to not a single one of these quarterbacks. Like, yeah, Zach Yeager was the starter at the beginning of last year. Maybe that would mean something if Coach Washington was still around, but he's not. Brown didn't recruit these players. He's bringing in 3 quarterbacks to fight it out who were all on the roster last year. They're all rollover guys. There's no reason for him to favor Yeager over a brick handler or over a hooker. No reason. So how did these 3 guys fare, though? Let's get into that. How did these 3 guys fare in the spring game? So you had Zach Yeager, who went 5 of 8 for 41 yards. Eli Brickhandler, who went 4 for 7 for 58 yards. And then you had Austin Hooker, who went 4 for Austin. I don't know if I pronounced that strongly, but Austin with an L. Hooker, who went 4 for 8 for 51 yards and a touchdown. I want to correct something that I did kind of wrong last week. When talking about this battle, I did not mention Hooker, and I should have, especially seeing that there's no sort of allegiance to anybody. This is fair game for everybody. You look at Yeager, redshirt sophomore. You look at Brickhandler, redshirt freshman. You look at Hooker, redshirt sophomore. These are all young players. There's no real huge age gap. You should expect them to all compete, and there's no veteran leadership. There's nothing that sets them apart. Everybody is fighting it out. So when you look at the difference in offense, the quarterbacks will tell the story. The quarterbacks are happy about the new offensive scheme that Vincent Brown is coming in with. You're looking at the fact that Zach Yeager praised it. He said, we throw the ball around a little more. I'm glad that we're open to throwing the ball around a little more. And we have some new pass concepts. We're trying to get the ball downfield a little bit. So now you get your first insight of what offense under Vincent Brown is going to look like. You're going to have more explosive attempts if you're an Aggies fan through the air. So I'm not expecting a Tootin type year where you set a record for most 100-yard rushing games in a row. I'm not expecting that. I'm expecting them to be more pass heavy, and the quarterbacks like that. You look at Brickhandler. He says, with the benefit of this offense, he said, allows me to do what I want, drop back comfortably, and just be the person I came here to be, the person I was recruited for. It's a natural fit for him. Yeager's happy about how much they're passing and how deep down the field they're passing. The 2 of the 3 quarterbacks, Hooker didn't make a comment close to this that was reported, but 2 of the 3 quarterbacks are happy about the changes in the offense. That's a good sign, I would say. That's a good sign for your quarterback position. Now, you're trying to replace your quarterback, your leading rusher, your leading receiver, your leading tackler. You have so many things that you're trying to replace at North Carolina A&T, but these offensive scheme changes are going to put a lot more pressure on your quarterback and a lot more pressure on your wide receiver. And just like all the other ones, they're to be announced, to be decided, to be continued in the fall camp. And speaking of to be continued, today's episode of Locked on HBCU will be continued as we discuss Joe Bryant and his MVP performance in the Reese's All-Star game. He was the best player on the court. So you already know this is something we have to dive into. I wouldn't have it any other way as we continue with Locked on HBCU. Before we get into that, today's episode is brought to you by Built Bar, the #1 protein bar on the market, bar none. And I wish I could give every single one of the Louisiana State University women basketball team a Built Bar because they did amazing. That was a phenomenal game to watch. Caitlin Clark did her thing too, but LSU came out on top. Angel Reese with the UKCB right in the face, pointing to the ring finger. I loved it. Don't care how you feel. I loved it. Okay, so I wish I could give them all. Matter of fact, I think I would give them a Built S'mores Puff. Matter of fact, that's the one that I would vote on BuiltMarchMadness.com. You should go too, because once you vote on your favorite Built bar of any kind, you get entered in and you could be one of 50 lucky Locked On listeners to get a free box of Built bars. Yes, free, delicious, tasty helpfulness in a bar. It's amazing. But you also get the chance to have 12 months free. 12-month supply of free Built bars. A year worth? Even I'd be jealous of that. And I even get some of them every now and then. So y'all go ahead and go to Built March Madness, or you can just go to Built.com and purchase some using the promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off your offer. And as we continue rolling with today's episode of Locked on HBCU, Joe Bryant made a statement at the Reese's All-Star game. Matter of fact, he made the statement that all HBCU athletes want to make. And that goes for football and basketball. When we're talking about these all-star type events like the Senior Bowl, the All-Star game that we're talking about right here, the mission is always the same for every single HBCU, small school, any school that has to fight against competition level stigmas. The mission is always the same. Go in and prove that I wasn't a product of a lower competition. This is who I am no matter who I'm going against. You got to prove that you can hang with the big dogs. And Joe Bryant did more than just prove he could go toe-to-toe. Joe Bryant did more than just prove he could hang with the big dogs. The Norfolk State guard went in there and proved that he could be the best player on the court with some of the best players in the nation. That's a big deal. If the mission is to show you can hang and you go in and you win MVP, you go in and you're the leading scorer, oh yeah, Joe Bryant did what he needed to do. Mission accomplished, mission obliterated, everything. This was probably one of the best performances that you could imagine, right? That was one of the best things that you could imagine. And listen, I'm a huge football guy. So a lot of my comparisons will draw back to my favorite sport. Doesn't mean it's a perfect parallel, but it's a good one in my opinion. I look at games like the Senior Bowl, NFLPA, the Shrine Bowl, but let's focus specifically on the Senior Bowl. Joshua Williams went in, he had a great game. You know, I've seen this for HBCU players, non-HBCU players. The two HBCU players, Miller and Land, that went this year, they got rave reviews. They had a really good game, really good week of practice. So I've seen these players go in and have great games. I've seen Jeremy Chin, who did a similar thing that I think Joshua Williams did. I think that Williams, it wouldn't be a stretch to say that Williams really cemented his status as the top HBCU player by what he did at the Senior Bowl. And you could say that same thing for Jeremy Chin, who probably moved his way up into the bottom of the second round with a good Senior Bowl performance. The impact of those are clear because we've seen them, but we didn't know what the impact was going to be right away. And I know I brought up impact, but I don't even think that should really be a metric when talking about this. I know people are going to look at it and like, oh, how will this impact? But here's the thing. A, it's inconclusive. Those things already happened. We had months to reflect on what that meant for them. But then also, B, there's only 2 rounds in the NBA draft. This isn't as close to football. That's what I mean when I say it's not a great parallel. So I don't know what this will do for his draft stock. If he doesn't get drafted, did it mean that it did nothing for his stock? I don't know. You know, I'm sure this had to boost it. But then lastly, I think by focusing on the impact of it, you're focusing too much on the future on a topic that should be very present centric. You should be focusing on right now. You should be focused on what he was able to do. And Joe Bryant was able to go in there and win MVP. You have to remember that Bryant was the only HBCU player selected into this game. That was a big deal. We talked about how Bryant being selected, it spoke volumes about his talent level, spoke volumes about what he was able to accomplish throughout his career, spoke volumes about what Norfolk State is as a program. If him simply being invited did all of that, then what did him winning MVP do? Had to be at least ×5, at least, because that was a performance that was incredible. It was better than most people probably would have expected. Maybe not Joe Bryant, but he said he wanted to show that HBCUs can hang with the PWIs. There doesn't need to be a separation. And you know what? I think that you proved that, at least for you. I don't, like, let's just be realistic. One person, one performance is not going to knock down a whole narrative. But for Joe Bryant, it showed that he belonged more than anything else could have. So he took full advantage of this opportunity. He highlighted it by scoring the game-tying 3 to push the game into overtime. And he ended up being served up with the MVP award. Joe freaking Bryant, a walking bucket at Norfolk State and a walking bucket Friday afternoon in Houston, Texas. Ain't nothing changed but the jersey. Now, speaking of players who are about to change jerseys, Isaiah Land. He's preparing to be an NFL draft pick, and that's exactly what he'll be. And when he was at the FAMU Pro Day, not only was he the biggest name, he was also the biggest story coming out of the day. Let's explore these narratives as we continue with Locked On HBCU. As we're wrapping up today's episode of Locked On HBCU, thank you for making us your first listen of the day, every day, and making it all the way to segment 3. I appreciate that, so thank you 2 times. Isaiah Land was more than just the biggest name of the day. He was also the biggest story coming out of FAMU's Pro Day. And that's because, listen, we now know things about his draft stock. We know things about how he views himself. And we also know things about what he's going to be preparing for going into the NFL draft. Let's not beat around the bush. Let's not set a scene. Let's dive directly into it. He chose not to run at the Pro Day. Now, that's not really a story. In my opinion, Pro Days aren't really much of a story anyway. That's why you haven't heard me cover any of them. I just don't think there's a story attached to it. That's something to be reported, but not analyzed, you know. But coming out of this, he didn't run. Tells me he's happy with his 4.66 from the scouting combine. Okay, cool, whatever. I always think that's an interesting decision. So I mentioned it. If you like your time, I wouldn't run either. I wouldn't run a second time. The most important thing that came out of this Pro Day for Land is the fact that he did linebacker drills when it came to being in a position drill. Now, if you recall, back at the beginning of March, I guess it would be, at the beginning of March, I spoke about how he did defensive line drills at the combine and about how that means he views himself as a hand-in-the-dirt player. I don't believe that that's changed. I believe that at the combine, he chose to be in defensive line drills. I think at this Pro Day, I think people who are guiding him, a time when he could go through the drills with his coaches probably said, listen, no, we've seen you with your hand in the dirt. Now, either these coaches, these scouts view you as an off-ball linebacker, or enough people are interested in you as an off-ball linebacker that you need to run these drills. You need to run these drills. And it's funny because, story time, but this kind of reminds me of when I was in high school playing ball, right? Michael Badajoe's been on the show, right? I went to high school with Badajoe. And the coach decided his senior year of high school, we're going to switch him over to linebacker. He had been a defensive end the whole time. But the reason he did that was because he felt that Badajoe was going to play defensive, or he's going to play linebacker at the next level. The thing about that is Badajoe went on to put a lot more weight. So I see why they thought that. But it wasn't the case. He went on to have a good career as a defensive end. He's even slid into defensive tackle at times. So the idea of him playing linebacker is crazy, but back then it wasn't. Now, after it happened and I see he went on to be a defensive end, was I kind of salty? Yeah, because I was his backup. I was his backup. And halfway through the year, it was like, oh no, this guy is a defensive end. And then I ended up starting. Like, I could have started the whole time, man. But that is my guy. You know that. Got love for you, bro. But I would have liked to start my whole senior year. It is what it is. I wasn't that good anyway. So it's not like my career would have went on and I've been like, I would have been the one playing college ball or anything. I just might have won in a couple games, but it's cool. I had a torn labrum that year anyway, played through that's not the important part. But the point is, your coaches are going to try to do what is best for you, what they see you doing in the future. And I think that's a sign. When your coaches say, listen, I know you want to be a defensive lineman. I know you want to run defensive lineman drills, but we're going to put you through these linebacker drills. It tells you exactly what they've been hearing. Because if that's what they just felt, like, mind you this, FAMU putting Isaiah Land through linebacker drills clearly tells you that scouts have came to them, either a good percentage of them or enough for them to want Land to showcase his abilities, have come to them and said, look, we view Isaiah Land as a linebacker. Because they didn't play Isaiah Land as a linebacker last year. They kept him with his hand in the dirt. If they truly were trying to prepare him for the next level or just trying to see that type of situation, then they probably would have had him standing up. They don't view him as that. They view him as a hand in the dirt player. But enough people have contacted them after the season for them to do that. Now, granted, it's not all about, this isn't like high school where you just, we think this is best for you. They're about winning games, and they saw he was the most productive at defensive end. But I do think it also has at least a little bit to do with the fact of how they viewed him. The scouts are clamoring. The scouts want him to be an off-ball linebacker. That's what this is. And one scout that was there, one team that was represented, and not even by a scout, was the Washington Commanders. I thought that was so interesting because the general manager showed up for the Commanders. Now, for those who aren't familiar, don't really pay attention to pro days, GMs don't typically go to pro days. And when they do, it's for a special player. It's a player who is, how do I want to say this? This is a player who is typically valued very highly. It's typically a top 10 selection. We know Isaiah Land isn't that. I'm not trying to put him in that category, but I'm just showcasing how rare it is for a general manager to show up. And the GM said, I came here for Isaiah Land. It's a lot of talent here, but I'm specifically here for Isaiah Land. But that was so telling. So his draft stock, what does it say? It says Isaiah Land is viewed as an off-ball linebacker. And it says that Isaiah Land is a player who is highly touted. If a GM of any organization, any franchise shows up to your pro day, people value you. They might not have all sent their GM, but the fact that the Washington Commanders did send their GM, I promise you, they're not sending their GM for somebody who they don't think a lot of other teams like. That says a lot about Isaiah Land's draft stock, and maybe specifically at off-ball linebacker. And on tomorrow's episode, we're going to be diving into the HBCU All-Star Game. We talked about what Joe Bryant was able to do in an All-Star Game. What about an All-Star Game full of HBCU talent? Let's dive into how that went on tomorrow's episode of Locked on HBCU. But I appreciate you for making us your first listen of the day, every day. For your second listen of the day, check out Locked on College Basketball. It's everything you need around the sport in one place. And in the meantime, in between time, if you're looking for me, you can find me on Twitter at South Exclusives. Until the next time that we hear each other, family, take care, stay blessed. Peace.